Tonight, we have Max Blumenthal here with us to discuss his new book, The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. This is Max's third book and his third time speaking here at Politics and Prose, following his award-winning Goliath and Republican Gomorrah, which was a New York Times bestseller. In the 51-Day War, he reports on the Israeli attack on Gaza that began on July 8th, 2014, and led to nearly 3 months of sustained and ferocious bombardment of the Palestinian territory. Max was on the ground in Gaza and witnessed the war and its many casualties firsthand. And in his reporting, he focuses on the human dimensions of the attacks, and particularly the social, economic, and political repercussions to Palestinians in Gaza, to Israelis themselves, and to those watching from around the world. One really can't read the book without worrying about the long-term consequences of this war or questioning whether it could have and should have been avoided in the first place. Max's reporting is brave, controversial in some quarters, and always important. As Reza Aslan wrote, Max Blumenthal has spent the last decade transforming himself into one of the most vital voices in journalism today, always speaking truth to power with fearlessness and integrity. Max currently writes for Alternet and is formerly a writer for the Daily Beast. So please join me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
Thanks. I need to time myself here so we have enough time for Q&A and heckling and so forth. My last talk in DC, I had Medea Benjamin in the audience, but I don't have anyone to take care of hecklers because I don't see her out there. She knows how to handle it. I was just in Scotland. I was on tour in the UK, and I achieved a real milestone out there, which was that for the first time I was refused entry to a Scottish pub. It was called Nice and Sleazy. And I was refused entry. I was told, I didn't know why. They said, you can't come in. And I was told by Scottish friends that because of my American accent, they thought I was drunk. Because Scottish people talk in really short bursts. So it's good to be back in my ancestral homeland of Washington, D.C. This is the third time, as you heard, I've been at Politics and Prose, so I really want to extend my gratitude to this bookstore for bringing this discussion here. My first book was, Republican Gomorrah. That was my first book that brought me here. I think this was my first talk about Republican Gomorrah, and I think that book has been sort of vindicated as the Huckabee Palin wing of the GOP is really taken over. The second book, Goliath, was heavily attacked, but Politics and Prose was willing to host me, and I think the analysis of Israeli society in that book has been pretty well vindicated by Netanyahu, especially his warning of droves of Arabs, buses full of Arabs descending on polling places, very reminiscent of some figures from the American past. And now we're here to talk about the 51-Day War. And it really was a war. I've been criticized by, supporters of Palestinian rights for calling it the 51-Day War and not calling it an assault. Of course, it was an assault. Of course, the violence was disproportionately wielded against one side. Of course, one of the parties in this conflict was the most sophisticated, well-armed military in the Middle East. And the overall situation is not a conflict. In my view, it is a conquest. So you'll never hear me refer to the Israel-Palestine conflict. If anything, it's a crisis. I want to, since we're limited on time, just start with just bring you into the first day of war, the first day of real combat. This book is part military history, and I think the military history helps explain where both societies are going and how both are interacting with one another, particularly Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And I call it the 51-Day War because it began on July 7th, not on July 8th, as is commonly reported, but on July 7th, when the facilities of the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, were attacked by Israeli airstrikes, killing several members of the Al-Qassam brigades, which led to the first authorized launch by Hamas and the Al-Qassam brigades of rockets into Israel. If we can do something about that sound, it would be wonderful, unless it's just in my head. Just days after the Operation Protective Edge, which translates into strong cliff or steep cliff in Hebrew, was authorized, The Israeli troops invaded the Gaza Strip. They invaded the area of Shujaiya, which is one of the most densely populated places on earth. It's basically an extension of Gaza City that halts at the 300-meter buffer zone that Israel maintains between its own border with the Gaza Strip and the civilian population of Gaza. It's a no-go zone. Anyone who enters this 300-meter zone can be shot by, for example, the spot and strike system, and that's the first photograph in my book. It is a remote-controlled machine gun aimed into the Gaza Strip, operated by an all-female unit of Israeli soldiers from tens of kilometers away who can eliminate anyone entering the buffer zone with the push of a joystick. So Shujaiya is located in a pretty tough neighborhood because it's next to Israel. Shujaiya has been heavily reinforced militarily, and I'm going to talk about that. Israeli troops invaded on July 12th, underestimating the capacity of the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, and of the 4 or 5 other armed factions which fought alongside Hamas's military wing. Now, to understand this battle, you have to understand the history of the Gaza Strip. You have to understand the history of the Al-Qassam brigades. When you think of the Al-Qassam brigades, and when we hear about them in our mainstream media and in the West, you think about one tactic, the suicide bombing. When you think about attacks on soft Israeli targets, the suicide bombing was implemented by the Al-Qassam brigades under the leadership of Yahya Ayyash in 1994 after Baruch Goldstein massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. Baruch Goldstein was a radical settler from Brooklyn. There's a memorial to him today in Kiryat Arba, the Israeli settlement, if you want to talk about terrorist memorials. And so the suicide bombing became a tactic that lasted all the way through the Second Intifada and tormented Israeli society. It lasted until 2005. It didn't end with the construction of the separation wall. It's very easy for Palestinians to get through the separation wall. It ended with the Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip. Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip, removing about 9,000 settlers. And when they removed the settlers, the occupation of the Gaza Strip was transformed to an occupation from within, the way the West Bank is occupied, to a panopticon model, an occupation from without, through drones, through walls, through the spot and strike system, through the naval siege which prevents Palestinian fishermen from fishing more than 3 miles at sea. And within the Gaza Strip, through the tunnel network at the Philadelphia corridor in Rafah, the armed factions were able to import the kind of weapons that a normal guerrilla army would possess. For example, AK-47s, heavier machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and these weapons were manufactured inside the Gaza Strip. The goal was to be able to confront the Israeli military directly. And with that, once that goal was launched, the suicide bombing went out of practice. This was achieved under the leadership of Mohammed Deif, who was general commander of the Al-Qassam brigades, and it was complemented by a sophisticated tunnel network under the Gaza Strip, which was used primarily for defensive purposes. In other words, the entry and exits of the tunnels were primarily inside the Gaza Strip, although there were infiltrations into Israel that I'll talk about in a second. So on July 12th, the Israeli military enters Shujaiya, enters in armored personnel carriers, the armed factions, which were basically lurking in tunnels, lured the Israeli military into the neighborhood. As the Israeli military began to occupy the neighborhood, they fell under attack. An armored personnel carrier, which was a Vietnam-era relic provided to Israel by the U.S. As kind of military surplus, was attacked by a sapper team from the Al-Qassam brigades, who essentially ran up to it and planted a homemade explosive charge on the personnel carrier, killing 8 soldiers. It sent it up into a ball of flames. One soldier was alive, Oron Shaul. He eventually would die of his wounds, but he was taken, and the goal of the Al-Qassam brigades was to capture as many soldiers as possible and keep them alive in order to use them as collateral to get a better ceasefire agreement or to get Palestinian prisoners out of jail, which Israel had refused to do that April under the U.S. brokered peace process, which led to its collapse. Shaul was taken, panic spreads through the Israeli high command, the military high command, and the attack on Shujaiya begins. The Israeli infantry finds itself, this is the Golani Brigade, the special forces of the Israeli Golani Brigade, some of the most highly trained forces in the Israeli military, find themselves under attack. And they're being attacked through tactics that the Al-Qassam brigades had learned from Hezbollah, which had kicked the Israeli military out of southern Lebanon when it occupied southern Lebanon, and then substantially defeated it in 2006 during the ground invasion. And one of these tactics proved key. The Al-Qassam fighters approached Israeli infantry and engaged them at less than 15 meters away, which nullified the two strengths of the Israeli military: air power. You can't provide air support because you're going to kill your own soldiers, and artillery. Israel has more artillery battalions than any military in the Middle East. You can't do that because the fragmentation will kill your own soldiers. And the Israeli infantry, meanwhile, these are soldiers who are much more accustomed to fighting 12-year-old stone throwers and old Falahi farmers in the West Bank than to actually being challenged by highly motivated young men who are literally defending their own neighborhood with inferior weapons, but with more motivation. And so one of the most cowardly military maneuvers in modern history was staged. The Israeli military, the infantry of the Golani brigades, pulls back. As many soldiers as possible entered more advanced armored personnel carriers, more modern, with better armored protection. And the Israeli military had amassed almost 50% of all of its artillery pieces at the border of Shujaiya prior to the battle. And they open fire on the entire neighborhood. They blanket the neighborhood as the armored personnel carriers make a mad dash for the border. About 7,000 shells, 155 millimeter howitzer shells, fell on this densely populated civilian area, leading to a massacre. Over 120 people were killed in about 24 hours. Many of the 18,000 homes that Israel destroyed partially or completely were destroyed within 24 hours. And you look at the cover of my book, it looks like Warsaw after World War II. That's Shujaiya after Israel reduced it to rubble with its artillery battalions, its missiles from its planes, in about 24 hours. So now we have to understand the doctrine of the Al-Qassam brigades and the doctrine of the Israeli military. The Al-Qassam brigades had endeavored to fight the Israeli military directly. Listen to the words of Mohammed Deif, the general commander who had survived 4 assassination attempts and would survive another one during the war, and whose entire nuclear family would be killed. We have prioritized confronting and killing the military and the soldiers at the checkpoints over attacking civilians at a time when the criminal enemy wades in civilian blood and commits massacres and brings down the roof of homes on top of the heads of their inhabitants. The more they attack civilians, the more justified it becomes for us to kill their soldiers. That was Mohammed Deif in words that were completely ignored in the Western media, as well as this statistic. 73 Israeli citizens were killed during the 51-day war. Citizens. Of those 73 citizens, 68 were combat soldiers attacking the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, 850 people, according to the Associated Press, were killed at home, mostly at night, in the Gaza Strip, 90% of whom were civilians. 25% of the over 2,200 people killed in the Gaza Strip, according to B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, were killed at home. Who is at home in 3 to 4 story homes? It's entire families. Families live together in the Gaza Strip, and when a new generation appears, the father or grandfather will build another level. And that is why, according to Haaretz, as Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported, 89 families were erased from the civil registry in the Gaza Strip because they lost most or all members. This is the result of a openly stated Israeli military doctrine called the Dahiya Doctrine, and it needs to be understood. In 2006, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the southern Beirut neighborhood called Dahiya, which was a stronghold of political support for Hezbollah. After this neighborhood was destroyed, then northern commander of the Israeli military, Gadi Eisenkot, gave an interview to Yediot Aharonot, one of the most influential newspapers in Israel. And by the way, Eisenkot is now the chief of staff of the Israeli military. He's been promoted since pioneering this doctrine which he explained as follows. We will apply what happened in the Dahia quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it's been approved. 2 years later, the Institute for National Security Studies, which is a military-linked think tank in Israel, produced a paper called Disproportionate Force. And it ended with the following. Such a response, a disproportionate response, aims at inflicting damage and meting out punishment to an extent that will demand long and expensive reconstruction processes. So these attacks were aimed not only at civilians, but at civilian infrastructure. And the point is that Eisenkot and the military intelligence apparatus of Israel concluded that it couldn't defeat Hezbollah or Hamas militarily, it couldn't dislodge them, and so it would attack the civilian population in order to demoralize it and hopefully turn it against the political leadership that it supported. It's a failed doctrine, as we've seen. Assault after assault comes, and each time the violence increases, attacks more and more of the civilian sector, and each time the civilian sector unites behind their armed factions. Benny Gantz, who was the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the assault on Gaza last summer, refers to these assaults as mowing the lawn, as if Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip are little blades of grass who have to be brought down to size every 2 or 3 years. But in Shujaiya, we saw the lawn burn down to the topsoil. The day after Shujaiya was destroyed, the Israeli military remained in the neighborhood. It took up posts in homes. And when I entered these homes after the military was gone, I found floors littered with bullets, homes substantially destroyed, and price tag graffiti on the walls. The same graffiti you find in the West Bank had been painted on the walls of some of these homes. The graffiti that radical settlers paint on Palestinian mosques and churches and homes, and on the home of Ali Dawabsha, the infant who was burned to death last week in the West Bank, was now being painted on walls with the full authorization of the State of Israel and its government. I also found, most depressingly and tragically, Stars of David inscribed in furniture and spray painted on walls, the symbol of the oldest monotheistic religion, the symbol of the faith community I was raised in, being represented by invading soldiers back to Palestinians as a religion of hatred and violence, something which deeply upset me when I found it. In Shujaiya, I found another clue, another thing that was deeply significant to me. In an empty ammunition box in a home that had been used as a sniper post by Israeli soldiers, I found a little map. And the map was a satellite map of Shujaiya, which had been produced 2 days before the invasion. On this map, homes were marked according to numbers. Many of those homes had been destroyed. I didn't fully understand it at the time. And there was a bright orange line across a lane in the center of the map that was marked in Hebrew, Hardufim. I came to understand that a month later when I went to Brussels to participate in the Russell Tribunal, which is a sort of mock tribunal of Israeli forces for atrocities committed in the Gaza Strip. And it was there that I was joined by Eran Efrati, who was a former Israeli combat soldier who served in Operation Cast Lead during the invasion of Gaza Strip in 2009, and who's basically dedicated his life to taking on the army in which he once served. And Efrati explained to me that Hardufim is what blares out on Israeli army radios when a soldier is killed. It means dead people, essentially. But he heard this command when soldiers operating inside the Gaza Strip were authorized to establish a free fire zone to essentially kill anyone who could be deemed a possible threat to their safety. Now, many of you are familiar with the case of Salam Shamali, the video of Salam Shamali. This was something that was transmitted to us, for example, on NBC News. We finally saw the intimate violence of the siege of Gaza and the invasion of Gaza, thanks to the work of Ayman Moaldin, who was strangely reassigned after reporting this and replaced by Richard Engel. This video showed a young man, a vendor, a 19-year-old vendor from Shujaiya, wading into the neighborhood to look for his parents and his brothers. He is escorted by International Solidarity Movement volunteers, essentially volunteers from the outside, internationals, who are wearing vests that show that they're, humanitarian volunteers. Shamali was just wearing street clothes. He wanders into where his home once stood as one of the ISM volunteers is filming, and he's hit by a sniper. He calls out for help. He's hit again. He crumples to the ground. He says one last word, and he's hit again and executed. He's killed on camera. Iran Efrati, after the war, interviewed 3 soldiers who served in Shujaiya who told them that they were told to establish a red line after they took up a civilian home in Shujaiya, and anyone who crossed that red line could or should be shot because they were a potential threat to their safety. And that is apparently what happened to Salam Shamali. He crossed the Hardufim line. You can see this map reproduced in my book. These are war crimes. These are war crimes that need to be prosecuted. The Shamali family deserves justice. I met the Shamali family the day I went to Shujaiya, back in Gaza City in a cramped apartment. And instead of justice, they'd been given antidepressant pills, very high dosage antidepressant pills. They told me that they learned about the death of their son when the YouTube clip of his killing was emailed to them by friends. And they knew it was him by the sound of his screams. This is an experience that was relayed to me by so many people I met in the border regions, in the destroyed border regions of the Gaza Strip. I unfortunately wasn't able to meet members of the Wahadan family when I traveled to Beit Hanun, which is a city in the northern Gaza Strip which was substantially destroyed by our Israeli artillery fire in the course of about 60 minutes. Most of this neighborhood, this area, was leafleted by the Israeli military. Most people left, and they avoided the kind of casualties that were seen in other border regions in Gaza. The Wahadan family was not allowed to leave. Israeli soldiers used their house as a base of operations and ordered the family to stay on the first floor for an entire week, from July 19th to July 26th. The men were sorted out, the military-aged men, and taken into jeeps to Israeli prison for interrogation and possible torture. And the young, the women, and the elderly were kept on the first floor of the home, used as human shields to protect the Israeli soldiers operating in the home. On July 26th, when it appeared that a humanitarian ceasefire was coming into effect, the Israeli military left. They told the Wahadan family, if you leave, we'll shoot you. Stay in your home. And then they ordered artillery strikes on the neighborhood, reducing the neighborhood to rubble, bringing the roof of this house down on the Wahadan family, and killing as many as 12 members. So when I arrived and I interviewed the neighbors, young men were still picking through the rubble to find the remains of 2-year-old Qena Wahadan and her 52-year-old aunt Baghdad. The body parts of the rest of the family had already been found. This was one of many cases of human shielding that was relayed to me, that I documented, and this case was confirmed by Defense of Children International, which is a respected NGO. As the Israeli assault went on, it became clear that the ground troops would pull out, and it would soon become a war in which rockets and missiles were exchanged. 2,000-pound fragmentation bombs against rockets, which packed a very light payload and did psychological damage. The United States was obstructing diplomacy all along. On August 1st, a ceasefire came into effect, a humanitarian ceasefire. And according to Secretary of State John Kerry, this is a very unusual ceasefire, because in a ceasefire, usually both sides are supposed to cease firing. But according to John Kerry's terms of the deal, the Israeli military was allowed to continue operating in the Gaza Strip. It wasn't clear that Hamas had even agreed to this deal, and so it led to the next massacre, known as Black Friday, in the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip, Rafah, in the eastern area, near Yasser Arafat International Airport, an airport that the Israeli military destroyed, whose runway was ravaged by bulldozers and then dug up by scavengers in 2009, who needed to rebuild their homes and needed concrete. A small unit of deployment of the Givati Brigade advances on eastern Rafah during a half hour before the ceasefire was to take effect. This small unit was led by Lieutenant Hadar Golden, the second cousin once removed of Moshe Ya'alon, the Israeli defense minister. Golden was one of the golden sons of Israel, a very significant figure. They occupy a home. The home comes under attack by an ambush team from the Al-Qassam brigades that springs out of a tunnel, attacks the soldiers with a rocket-propelled grenade, and then opens fire with light weapons, killing 2 and badly wounding Golden, who would later die of his wounds. The guerrillas of the Al-Qassam brigades attempt to take Golden alive because, as I explain later, they want to enact a prisoner exchange. And when they take him alive, this is the nightmare. I mean, this is a nightmare scenario for not only the Israeli military, but the Israeli government, a right-wing government whose constituents hate prisoner swaps, hate releasing Palestinians, because many of these Palestinians are charged with what's known as security crimes or attacking Israelis. It's politically impossible. So something had to be done to prevent this. Hannibal blared out from Israeli military radios. Hannibal, Hannibal. What is Hannibal? In 1986, the Israeli military devised a semi-secret military policy called the Hannibal Directive. According to the Hannibal Directive, the military is authorized to not only kill guerrillas who capture its soldiers, but to kill the soldiers themselves and even Israeli citizens in order to prevent a prisoner swap. And it's been enacted many times over the past. And it was enacted in the case of Hadar Golden as he was spirited away into a tunnel. Massive firepower came down on Eastern Rafah, because in order to kill a soldier who's been captured, you have to attack the entire circumference of the area because you don't totally know where he is. He's moving around. The Al-Qassam fighters are taking him somewhere. You have to attack the entire area. Every mode of destruction came down on Eastern Rafah. Naval shelling, tank shelling, 2,000-pound fragmentation missiles. When I visited Eastern Rafah, 1,000-pound Mk-82 U.S.-made dumb bombs, I felt them crushing under my feet just walking down a street. The attack, the destruction was so comprehensive that when I met the Kadan family, one of the families that had escaped, that had survived this attack, that killed as many as 150 people in a very short period of time, their children were playing with spent mortar shells and a spent flare in the middle of the room, which they had found in their yard. The Kadan family, when they felt the missiles falling right next to their home, attempted to escape. They filed out single file into the street towards the Al-Najjar hospital as they watched their neighbors drop like flies. When they reached the Al-Najjar hospital, the only functioning medical facility in Rafah, the Israeli military called the hospital with its intention to bomb it, forcing all of the wounded, the dead, and the hospital staff to pour out. The only other medical facility in the area that could treat people was called the Kuwaiti Hospital. And it's actually not a hospital at all. It's a dental clinic, an OBGYN dental clinic. And it was there that I met Dr. Samir Holmes, who told me, he was the chief doctor, lead doctor, how he performed emergency amputations in the hallways and in dental chairs, how one of his nurses came to work in a body bag with her body bisected by a drone missile, and how her colleagues, the other nurses, fainted and he had to revive them to get them to continue working. The carnage became so bad for Holmes and his staff that they had to call local shops to deliver ice cream coolers in order to store the corpses of dead infants. And the image, which you can easily Google right now, of 5 dead infants wrapped in white shrouds in an ice cream cooler, is to me the defining image of the 51-day war and the assault on the Gaza Strip. Those children should have been eating ice cream. By August 14th, the Israeli military produced an estimate of the munitions that it fired inside the Gaza Strip in order to receive funding and an increase in its budget. It estimated that it fired 3 million bullets. That's almost 2 bullets for every resident of the Gaza Strip. Around 3,000 tons of ammunition, 25,000 tank shells, around 20,000 artillery shells which are made for conventional armies fighting conventional armies. There is no conventional army in the Gaza Strip. The factions in the Gaza Strip fired between 2,000 to 3,000 rockets into Israel. Those rockets cumulatively pack an explosive charge that is the same as 20 missiles that the Israeli military fired into the Gaza Strip. According to Hamza Abu Murad, who was the bomb disposal chief for the volunteer brigades who defused the hundreds upon hundreds of bombs and munitions that were unexploded and left in civilian areas of the Gaza Strip, and who was himself killed defusing one, the Israeli military deployed 18,000 tons of ammunition, of explosives in the Gaza Strip, which is on about the same amount that the U.S. used in one nuclear bomb it dropped on Hiroshima. The war ended with a series of assassinations and then another cowardly act that I would describe as state terror, in which civilian residential high-rises were deliberately brought down in targeted airstrikes, beginning with Zafar 4. Zafar 4 was home to the engineers, the doctors, the teachers, the educated middle-class people of Gaza City who have no involvement in the conflict. It's known as Fatah City because so many of them are supporters of Hamas's political rival. And like Hiroshima, this area was considered pristine by the Israeli military. It was brought down, and 40 to 50 families were left homeless after being evacuated. A 14-story residential high-rise with no military value was brought to the ground. And those families set up tents next door to their apartment building, as Palestinians have done since 1948. Next was the Italian compound, home to 50 families. This is days before the war was ending, when a ceasefire was inevitable. And the Italian compound, built by an Italian businessman in the 1960s, also home to the educated middle class in central Gaza City, was destroyed by Israeli missile strikes. A shopping mall in Rafah was then destroyed, and then finally the Basha Tower. Now, if you talk to anyone from the Gaza Strip, they'll tell you that the Basha Tower is as much a part of their memory as the Twin Towers are to any New Yorker. It's the largest civilian high-rise in Gaza City. It's the oldest, and it's home to the offices of Gaza's media. It's where the media works in Gaza. For example, Saud Abu Ramadan, who's a stringer for Bloomberg News, his office was there. It's where he hosts the Western correspondents from Bloomberg when they come to work. The Basha Tower was brought down in targeted airstrikes after its inhabitants, its residents, were evacuated. In other words, a building that's about the same as the Thomson Reuters building in Times Square was targeted by a foreign military and brought down. This is the same as a foreign army bringing down the CNN tower in Atlanta. It's almost like fanatical terrorists attacking a satirical magazine in Paris, except none of you were asked to display solidarity for the journalists working in Basha Tower. None of you were compelled to declare "Je suis Basha" or to identify with the 16 Palestinian journalists who were killed covering the conflict and who were not afforded the same protections as I was. And it's because they're not worthy victims. I was one of 3 international reporters at the memorial ceremony for the 16 Palestinian journalists killed in the war, who were killed by the Israeli military. My colleagues, Dan Cohen and Jesse Rosenfeld, who also happened to be my roommates in Gaza City, were there. And in our little apartment that we rented, we considered putting a sign on the door that said the offices of Blumenthal, Cohen, and Rosenfeld. But, the last second, we decided against that. I want to close by just telling you about one of my friends whose best friend, his brother-in-law, was killed in the war, whose cousins I met in the rubble of Shujaiya, who told me that their family members had been massacred, who's a teacher, who's someone I identify with very much, just as a writer and someone who does similar work to me. He's a literature professor at Islamic University named Rifat Al-Arir. And I met Rifat in Berkeley, actually, when he was on a speaking tour for the book he edited called Gaza Writes Back, which is a compilation of essays and writings by Gaza-based writers. Rifat had a really important moment when he was in the U.S. He had grown up in the Gaza Strip, and he had his application to pursue his PhD in England blocked by the Israeli military. His academic ambitions were consistently blocked by the Israeli military, in addition to having family members killed. This is blocked by a military and a state that identifies itself as the Jewish state, that claims to speak on behalf of all the world's Jews. And Rifat told me freely that when he lived in the Gaza Strip, before he was able to leave and come to the U.S., he held what we would consider to be anti-Semitic attitudes. He said it was like his Malcolm X moment, when Malcolm X is in prison and he meets a member of the Nation of Islam who asks him to think about all the white people he had ever met in his life, and to ask himself, have you ever had a positive experience with one of them? Have you ever met a white person who didn't seek to harm you or manipulate you? And Malcolm X, then Malcolm Little, concluded, no. White people are the problem in my life. And Rifat thought of all the Jews he had met, living under siege and occupation in the Gaza Strip, who had denied him permits, who had attacked his neighbors, who had killed his family. And he concluded, no, it's the Jews that are the problem. It was only when he was able to come to the United States and stay with Jews who were resisting the occupation, who were resisting Zionism, that he was able to think his way out of this mentality and understand that there's a clear difference between Judaism and Zionism, that there's no Jewish consensus on supporting the state of Israel, that we, Jews, like any other community, are extremely diverse and hold competing views. And of course, we support the Iran deal, by the way, more than any other demographic group in the US. So clearly, we're diverse in the way we think. When Rifat returned to the Gaza Strip, he dedicated himself to helping his students understand the same thing. And so he taught them the Hebrew poet Yehuda Amichai, someone who they actually could identify with. He taught them The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. And it was through The Merchant of Venice that he helped them identify with Shylock, a very flawed figure who was living under an apartheid-like regime and had to make very difficult choices and to compromise himself in many ways. Rifat said that when his students were asked at the end of this class, when he asked them, who do you identify with more, Othello, the Venetian general of Arab descent, or Shylock, the Italian Jew, one after another, unanimously, they said they identified with Shylock. One student produced a kind of revision or repurposed Shylock's famous Cri de Coeur, Nor el Borno. And she wrote, hath not a Palestinian eyes, hath not a Palestinian hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian or a Jew is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Rifat took that paper and all the papers his students produced on The Merchant of Venice and stored them away in his desk at the English department of Islamic University like little treasures. And on August 2nd, the Israeli military attacked the Islamic University and sent those papers up in flames, leading his students to joke that they had produced PMDs, or poems of mass destruction. You know, this isn't a complicated situation. Don't let anyone tell you it's complicated. And it's not about good and evil. There's good and evil on both sides. It's about justice and injustice. It's a basic issue of fairness and rights. And it's an emergency situation. I'll leave you with the words of Rayed Bakr, who was the captain of a fishing boat. He took me out on the sea the day after the ceasefire in order to test what was supposed to be a new agreement that would allow his crew to sail 6 miles at sea, to get closer to the coral reefs where most of the fish are, to be able to finally feed their families. And of course, at 3 miles at sea, we were turned back by an Israeli naval ship which threatened to open fire and arrest the crew. When we got back to the dock, Captain Bucker told me that he lost 2,000 shekels on this trip and that he had to somehow feed his crew, who then had to feed their families. So you're talking about something like 90 people who lost money and livelihood on this one boat. And I said, well, what do you want me to tell Americans? What do you want me to tell people back in Washington? And he said, it's really simple. Don't send us your aid. Don't send us your charity. Just put pressure on Israel so they get out of our seas so we can feed our families again and have a livelihood. So you have to ask yourselves how you can do that if any of these stories resonated with you, how that can be done. And you have to consider that it can't be done through any presidential candidate running in this race or through virtually anyone in Congress. So ask yourselves, what can you do? How can that be done? Thanks a lot.
Please come to the microphone and use it, and please try to keep your questions succinct so we can get to as many people as possible.
Thank you for writing this book and telling us the truth. We couldn't figure out what the truth was when those events that you describe happened because the media in America, in Washington, D.C., where I live, a paper that I have subscribed for 40-some years, did not tell us the truth. And the television stations did not tell us the truth. Even the public television station, they censor the news, even though we periodically give them money to stay up in the air. But my question is related to a book that was discussed here a few years ago, written by a gentleman who was the King Hussein advisor. And the book is called, I believe, Counsel to the King, and was discussed by his son and a newspaper person from, I don't know what newspaper, maybe the Washington Post. And I read the book and heard what they said, and the conclusion was the version of the Middle East that exists in America is a lie, a total lie. My question to you is, why is it a lie in America? We're supposed to be a democracy. Although being here since 1967, I see that democracy fading slowly away. Why are the American people believing a version of those events that you described and the other events that occurred before and afterwards that are far from the truth?
Thanks. Let's take one more and I'll answer them both at the same time so we can get as many in as possible.
This is an easier question.
Yeah.
The UN. There were several UN facilities. We got very mixed up stories about whether they were attacked or they were identified, and you haven't mentioned them. So if you could clear that up. I should say I'm a member of J Street and New Israel Fund. We do what we can. It's an uphill battle.
Thanks for your question. I'll answer that one first because I was just on a panel. Can we postpone the kibitzing until after? Let me answer that question and then we'll get to you. I was just on a panel with Chris Gunnis, who is the spokesman for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is in charge of Palestinian refugees. And Gunnis explained that he provided coordinates of the UN schools in the Gaza Strip where thousands of Palestinians had taken shelter after their neighborhoods were substantially destroyed to the Israeli military as many as 30 times. And yet the military still attacked. I visited one of these schools and found dried blood still in the courtyard where over a dozen people had been killed in a targeted strike. Same thing happened in Rafah, which led to a rare condemnation of Israeli disproportionate violence from the State Department. Of course, they did nothing to stop it. In fact, after the assault on Shujaiya, the Obama administration allowed Israel to rearm with this surplus of weapons that the Pentagon maintains in Israel, specifically to get more mortar rounds and artillery shells. So what are they going to do with that? And the question on the media is a really broad question. There are so many reasons why, and I think we all have a pretty sophisticated understanding that the media is not providing a balanced picture of a very imbalanced situation in which one side has been occupied for over 50 years. But there was an interesting development during this assault on Gaza, and it started with the killing of the Bakr boys, the 4 young kids who were playing tag in the port in Gaza City, right in front of the Al Dira Hotel where all the journalists stay. So they were basically playing tag with journalists about as close as I am to the end of this room. The Israeli Navy opened fire, killed them with naval shells right in front of the International Press Corps. And for the first time, a lot of these journalists were able to see this violence up close. I talked to a reporter who had covered Israel-Palestine from the West Bank for much of his career, and he had gone into the Gaza Strip, and he told me how he visited the Bach house, the home of the Bach family, which was targeted because the father of this family was the head of Gaza's police, so he's considered a military target. And he found fingers on the ground and arms in the trees when he arrived. So this was actually kind of a radicalizing experience for much of the media, and there was no way they couldn't report this kind of violence. The thing is, the media went away. Basically, with James Foley's beheading by ISIS, they packed up and went to Kurdistan to cover ISIS, and Gaza has been ignored ever since. The humanitarian crisis has only deepened, and there's very little reporting on it. So the pressure has to continue, and the pressure should continue from J Street, but instead, J Street, I want to tell you, J Street is obstructing the only grassroots mechanism for applying this pressure on Israel, which is the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. It's time for J Street to get out of the way. And those of you who just get out of the way, don't do anything, just stop obstructing it, stop joining with right-wing groups, stop joining with Christian Zionists to obstruct a grassroots movement for human rights on campuses and in churches and in places where people want to do this. And let Jewish Voices for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine do this work. That's all we're asking from you.
You seem to equate Zionism with occupation and imposition of one people on another people. Do you think it's possible for there to be a Jewish state in the Middle East and not have some of the host of negatives that you've outlined here obtain?
That's a great question. Thank you. And we'll take another one.
First of all, I want to say I'm glad you talk about this from what America represents in this whole picture. I think that's important, and this starts in the beginning with 1948. But what I'm really interested in is there a way to get at a deeper analysis as to really what's going on in this conflict here, so to speak, and what are the results as far as real estate? Who's winning in that area? Where are the forces behind this type of aggression? Rather than talk about Israel and Palestine, who are the people? Where is the organizational force that benefits from this type of behavior?
Okay, another good question. A little bit broad, but I'll do my best within short and as briefly as possible. In order to have a Jewish state in the Middle East, which is an area where most people are not Jewish, where most people are Arab and Muslim, and the second largest religious demographic is Christian, and you're talking about an exclusively Jewish state, you have to, first of all, maintain a demographic majority of Jews. And that means that you have to identify the indigenous Palestinian population as a demographic threat, meaning the birth of their children is a greater threat than rockets from Hamas or Hezbollah, because they threaten to swamp you demographically and topple the Jewish state. When you hear people talk about destroying Israel, BDS is calling for destroying Israel. It's because they're talking about unraveling the ethnically exclusive foundations of a self-proclaimed Jewish state, which doesn't actually have the consent of most of the world's Jews in the first place. In order to do that, you have to practice great violence. You have to ghettoize Palestinians. You have to build walls. This has been happening since the second Aliyah. And so what we see with the Gaza Strip is an area, to understand the Gaza Strip, to understand why this is happening, you have to understand Zionism, and you have to understand how an ethnically exclusive Jewish state is maintained. 72 to 80% of the people who live in the Gaza Strip are refugees. They're refugees from what is now Israel, and they can't return according to the rights granted to them in Resolution 194 of the UN because they're not Jews. If they return, it's no longer a Jewish state, because they're demographic threats. Now apply that to your own reality as a liberal in the United States. How many African Americans is too many? Do we need to have a white state in the U.S., a white Christian state? I know that there are some ethnic supremacists in the United States who want that, but we demonize them incorrectly. There's no political space for them. But even within liberal circles, it's legitimate to refer to Palestinians as a demographic threat, to refer to the birth of their children as a threat. And that is because Zionism is still legitimized. Now, just to go back, before political Zionism was implemented, there were alternative streams of Zionism, like the kind introduced by Asher Ginsburg, Ahad Ha'am, which is cultural Zionism, that Jews can have a place in Israel-Palestine, which was then Palestine. They can have a spiritual connection to it. But to have a political state, to establish a political state on the backs of the indigenous people will lead to unending crisis, violence, bloodshed, and tragedy that will consume Jewish life everywhere. And so Ha'am was right. He was kicked out of the Zionist Congress. He was a prophet. And we need to go back to those early prophets in order to forge a path forward where Jews and Palestinians can live together and have equal rights to enjoy the same equality that we're still fighting for here.
My question was, who are the people?
Yeah, but I'm not at your question yet. Let me just... Who are the people? Well, I'm not like, the guy who's going to pull back the curtain, but let me just, we hear a lot about the pro-Israel lobby, and that's one important piece of analysis. John Mearsheimer just claimed vindication for his book, which got him attacked as an anti-Semite because of the debate around the Iran deal. The pro-Israel lobbies, going full bore to stop it. But there's another aspect here. There's another dimension which is important to understand, which is that one of Israel's top 3 industries, maybe top 2 industries, is weapons export. This is, a country that's about the size of New Jersey, and it's one of the top 7 weapons exporters in the world. It doesn't have the greatest weapons, they're good weapons. But what it has, the advantage it has over other militaries, is that it gets to test those weapons routinely on a restive indigenous population. And so when you go to a weapons fair anywhere in the world, you go to the Israeli booth, the Israeli retailers from Elbit or Raphael, and those weapons say field tested, or even tested in Gaza, like the Spike 4 missile, which was exported after it was used to kill dozens of police cadets at a graduation ceremony in the Gaza Strip in an act of mass cop killing. That's the advantage the Israeli military has. There's a really cozy relationship between the defense ministry and Elbit Systems, which is one of Israel's, that's Israel's largest company. Ehud Barak served in Sayeret Maktal, the commando unit, with Mickey Fetterman, who's the longtime CEO of Elbit Systems. And so Barak was in charge of the assault on Lebanon in 2006, Gaza in 2008, 2009, and Gaza in 2012, testing the weapons that Fetterman would later benefit from, and Barak would move into, would market as kind of a lobbyist. It's no surprise that Barak is now one of the 100 wealthiest Israelis. According to Yotam Feldman, who is an Israeli journalist who produced one of the best documentaries on Israeli society ever made, The Lab, 150,000 families subsist off of the Israeli weapons export industry. That's not people, families. That's like the entire upper middle class. And so what incentive does Israel have for signing a peace deal, a comprehensive peace deal, for ending an occupation? It doesn't have one. The occupation and these assaults are incentivized and are an economic boon to an elite sector of Israeli society. Jeff Halper has a book coming out about this, and Rania Kalik, who's here, writes about this for Electronic Intifada, and I think it's a subject that needs to be explored in detail, and understanding why Israel has been so obstinate in dealing with Palestinians in the wider Arab world.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you for your question.
Hey. Something you mentioned in your book is uncovering evidence of a policy of summary execution of Hebrew speakers. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
I don't have evidence. Thank you for that question, but let's do the two at once. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you.
I'm with Jewish Voice for Peace. And of course, Max, you mentioned Jewish Voice for Peace and the fact that we are one of the organizations that supports boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I thought it would be helpful if you could mention a little bit about why some organizations like ours have moved beyond just focusing on the settlement products or on products that are produced or companies that operate in the occupied territories. And we're saying that it's important to really focus on all Israeli products and those products that are produced in the occupied territories. And I'd also like to mention that we are sponsoring BDS actions. The movement is now very international. We have something going on here. We're going to be actually launching a new campaign against Hewlett-Packard, and maybe you can say a few words about that too. Thanks.
I mean, I'll take the second one first, just so I can state clearly that I'm not a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm not a spokesman for Jewish Voice for Peace. I support what they're doing. And correct me if I'm wrong, I was told by S.D. Chandler, who's the head of your LA chapter, that Jewish Voice for Peace is the fastest growing Jewish organization in America.
Correct.
I think that's
That is
right.
In other words, there are bigger organizations which have much more money, but they're not gaining membership because younger Jews care about social justice. They care about other people, and they're joining Jewish Voice for Peace in droves, including after joining J Street U and finding that it obstructs BDS on campus. I can't speak to what you're doing with HP. That's for you to speak to, but I just want to talk about your broader question about settlement products. You have to boycott the source of the settlements, and it's the Israeli government which is funding the settlements. I mean, the way it works is that Israel is one of the most unequal societies. I think it has one of the highest inequality rates in the OECD, and so, I mean, to live in Tel Aviv is damn near impossible right now if you're, lower middle class. So what the Israeli government does is it takes its lower middle class and working class and gives them cheap settlement units, and it puts those settlement units on Palestinian land. You live in a settlement, you want a cell phone tower near you. Orange, the cell phone company, has cell phone towers out there, supplies services to the settlements. Remax, which is a company right here, a real estate company right here, is selling homes in the occupied territories. So why would you just, tackle one company that happens to operate in the occupied territories when the Israeli government provided the funding for Migron, which is the radical settlement where Meir Ettinger gathered his support base. Ettinger is the grandson of Meir Kahane. He's the person that the Israeli police have just arrested in connection with the burning alive of the Dawabshe family. Ettinger is a product of the state. He's been supported by the state. It's the same thing with Yitzhar, the radical settlement, the settlement where he was radicalized, supported with hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Israeli government and from a 501c3 nonprofit in New York City called the Central Fund for Israel. So those need to be targeted as well. And then beyond that, you're not targeting them because you hate Israelis, because you want to stick it to Israelis. This isn't a witch hunt. Like, I've sat on panels with Israelis. The question is whether they're, when it comes to the cultural and academic boycott, whether they are coming to the United States as ambassadors for the state of Israel. And that's when they're boycotted. That's not, so this isn't about personally targeting people because of their nationality. And I think the most important aspect of the BDS movement is the cultural and academic aspect of it, because it will help wake the 15 to 20% of Israeli society, which does have empathy for Palestinians, but is forced to self-censor and is under enormous pressure, who mostly live in the Central Coast. It'll help shake them out of their stupor when they're denied concerts, they're denied the sense of normalcy they enjoy. And the academic sector is intimately intertwined with the Israeli military. In fact, the person who designed the Israeli ethics code for the military, which allows all this violence, is Asa Kasher, who's been a professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University. And it's according to this code, which allows soldiers to essentially shoot anyone who they see as a threat in the Gaza Strip, that we've seen horrific violence, like what I documented, the shooting of men over 50 who spoke Hebrew. We saw many situations, and I documented many situations across Gaza, maybe several situations, in which Palestinians described to me being taken out of their home at night by soldiers. The soldiers would ask, does anyone here speak Hebrew? And if anyone answered in the affirmative, they would be shot. The father of Mahmoud Abu Said, a 19-year-old who was taken as a human shield, who I wrote about in Rafah, his father was shot for this reason. Or he was shot. I don't know why. One theory is that that Hebrew speakers can understand orders and they're seen as kind of a threat. Another theory is that they're encouraging, that by shooting Hebrew speakers, you're encouraging separation, which is sort of official policy, and you're telling them, don't try to help us. We don't want you. One of the most hideous incidents I documented was the killing of Mohammed Matar Abadla. He was a medic who was attempting to retrieve a body of a Palestinian man who had been lashed to a tree by Israeli soldiers in Hosea when this village was under a closed military order, meaning that no paramedics could enter, and it was a hellhole. And so this group of paramedics from the Palestinian Red Crescent, because the Red Cross wouldn't go to this village because they coordinate with the Israeli military, attempted to retrieve the body. The Israeli military orders Matar out of the car, out of his ambulance. This is on July 26, orders him to take several steps forward, tells him to hold a lighter over his head, and shoots him in the chest, killing him on the spot. This incident was described to me by his two colleagues. I have their testimony on video, and we'll release it. And so I interviewed Colonel Desmond Travers, who is one of the 4 authors of the Goldstone Report, the UN fact-finding mission on Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009. And what Travers told me was that, according to this code of ethics, which allows you to kill anyone who's seen as a threat, people holding mobile phones can be seen as a threat because they might be performing command and control for local armed factions. And so Travers' theory was that the soldier, and he had documented cases of this in the Goldstone Report of men with mobile phones being shot, that the soldiers ordered Abadla to hold the lighter over his head so they could justify killing him on the basis that they thought he was holding a mobile phone. These are all theories, but the killings are pretty well documented, and they're sadistic killings that need to be understood as part of a wider policy. So a couple more, and then I'll talk to you guys after as much as you want.
At the end of your remarks, you talked about the lack of interest in the Palestinian cause among American policymakers. Now, 25 years ago, we had a president who said we were going to forbid loan guarantees until you stop building settlements, George H.W. Bush. Now, today, what is Hillary Clinton's attitude on this? Is there a subtle, sort of behind-the-scenes desire to advocate this cause, if not stated publicly?
Another great question. And then you'll be the last question. Go ahead, yeah. If you can just hold that mic.
Can you do this?
Yeah, just hold that mic.
Well,
There you go.
you speak of, that AIPAC doesn't speak for all Jews, and I agree with you. But you speak of the Israeli government as if it speaks for all Israelis. I know that those who don't support the government are very much weakened and threatened. What, if anything, are they doing or saying on this question of Gaza? And what can be done to strengthen and support them?
Yeah, excellent questions. The first one on Hillary, I just fired off an email to her. I said full BDS, and she wrote please print. So that's a joke for any members of the Free Beacon who are here right now who don't understand humor. Well, after George H.W. Bush called for a momentary withholding of loans because of Israeli to demand a settlement freeze by the Israelis, which was successful. This was, we were heading towards a presidential race, and Bill Clinton was seeking to raise money for the presidential race. He got in pretty good with Haim Saban, who's an Israeli-American billionaire who has earned his fortune from the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers enterprise, and has said that his main cause is Israel. He doesn't care about any other causes in the U.S. He attempted or considered buying the L.A. Times in order to change its coverage on Israel. And along with Sheldon Adelson, who works the Republican side on behalf of the pro-Israel lobby, they openly mulled the idea of buying the New York Times, which, to me is, not exactly an anti-Zionist bastion. But the point is that, the Democrats under Bill Clinton were consolidated as the base of pro-Israel support and were heavily funded as such. And Hillary Clinton represents that wing of the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton supports the Iran deal. But we have to understand the implications of the Iran deal for Palestinians, the implications on the ground in Israel-Palestine. Barack Obama also represents this element of the Democratic Party. Obama claimed that Golda Meir was one of his great inspirations at Jeffrey Goldberg's synagogue down the street. Golda Meir, who's this wonderful multiculturalist who said Palestinians don't exist in her Milwaukee accented Hebrew. So we see all sorts of pandering. Because Hillary Clinton wants to support the Iran deal, she issued a personal letter, which was probably written by some AIPAC-oriented functionary, to Haim Saban, promising to take on BDS on the campaign trail and while president, to basically take on the speech of Americans, to take on a grassroots human rights movement. This is her concession. I don't know what she's going to do about it, but in Scotland recently I saw that she, as Secretary of State, attempted to apply pressure on a film festival that had refused donation from pro-Israel interests. So the Iran deal is likely to have terrible implications for Palestinians. I support it completely for other reasons. But we see proposals in Congress to increase annual aid to Israel from $3 billion to $4.5 billion a year. What is that aid spent on? It's not on helping poor Israelis in Ashkelon. It's on requiring them to buy weapons from Texas and Colorado to use against Palestinians. All of these security guarantees Israel's getting are for weapons to use against the Gaza Strip, or primarily against the Gaza Strip and maybe southern Lebanon. Moshe Ya'alon, the defense minister of Israel, very close ally of Netanyahu, declared in April at a conference of Shurat Hadin, which is an Israeli legal foundation, that we will attack Lebanon. When we attack Lebanon, we will hurt civilians, including children. And those were his words, and it will be with those weapons supplied by the U.S. So the Iran deal requires mollification and actual bribery of Israel, and Netanyahu is still refusing to participate in security coordination with the U.S. until as long as this debate is going on. So it's not like it's having any effect in Jerusalem. But that's I don't see any potential for lobbying Hillary Clinton on this issue. However, I know that Jewish Voice for Peace I've heard that they hired their first lobbyist in Washington. So they do see some openings there, and they're meeting with congressional staff. And obviously, people in Congress are pretty disgusted with Netanyahu. The question is, when are they going to be able to come out. And I don't see that happening. I mean, that's why I emphasize the importance of BDS, because it at least gives you something to do for now as citizens. The final letter in BDS is sanction, and that's to be applied by a government. And I hope it doesn't have to come to that. But for now, it's about boycott and divestment, and it's because of the impossibility of gaining traction in the two-party system because of the role of campaign finance. I'm supposed to end right now, so thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you right after.